Falcon, eject, eject now. The engine explodes at 40,000 feet and every voice on the radio screams the same word, except hers. Because while two combat pilots panic beside her, wrestling with the sight of her jet trailing fire across the sky, Captain Reese Calder does something no one in that squadron expects. She goes quiet, ice quiet, the kind of calm that only comes from a woman who has already stared death down once before and walked away asking for coffee. Negative, she says. I have the aircraft. What none of them know yet, what they're about to learn, in the most terrifying 90 seconds of their careers, is that the woman they mocked 8 hours earlier for a call sign they thought was a joke isn't just any pilot. She's the one they whisper about in officers' clubs, the one who shouldn't exist, and she's about to prove, one wheel, one wing, and one impossible landing at a time, exactly why they call her Falcon. Wolf Haven Air Force Base did not sleep. It simply changed the way it stayed awake. By day, it hummed with jet engines and forklifts and the low mechanical chatter of 100 small systems, keeping 30 combat aircraft ready to fly on 4 minutes' notice. By night, it turned into something quieter and stranger, wind pressing against hangar doors, frost creeping up the edges of windows, the far mountains disappearing into a darkness so complete it felt less like nightfall and more like the world simply forgetting to finish itself. At 4 a.m, that wind was the only thing moving. It scraped along the ridgelines above the base, the way it always did, the way it had probably done for 10,000 years before anyone thought to build a runway beneath it. It rattled a loose section of cargo netting against the side of Hangar 3, a sound nobody had bothered to fix in longer than anyone currently stationed there could remember, because fixing it meant walking out into 15 below, just to silence a strip of nylon rope, and nobody wanted that badly enough. So it kept clanging, all night, all morning, a metronome for a base that ran, mostly, on caffeine and unspoken rank, and the particular kind of restlessness that came from spending your career at the edge of a country that most of the country never thought about. Frost coated the tarmac in a thin blue sheen. It looked soft. It wasn't. Somewhere near the flight line, a maintenance crew moved between two Raptors with flashlights and clipboards, breath fogging thick in front of their faces, voices low, the kind of low that came less from discretion and more from the simple fact that cold this deep made talking loudly feel like a waste of warmth. And inside the briefing room of the 90th Fighter Squadron call-sign Dicemen, self-appointed royalty of a frozen kingdom, nobody else particularly wanted. The smell was always the same. Burnt coffee, ozone-off old electronics, sweat that never quite left the flight suits, no matter how many times they went through the wash. And ego, so much ego it had its own gravitational pull, bending the whole room slightly toward whoever happened to be talking the loudest at any given moment. Because that was the thing about the 90th. You didn't get assigned here. You earned it. You clawed your way in through years of dogfights and simulator scores and exactly the right kind of swagger. And once you were in, you were untouchable. Kings of a kingdom made of ice and radar-absorbent paint, ruling over 4 hours of daylight in December, and the permanent low-grade certainty that you were better than whoever they sent next, which made the room the perfect place to watch a woman get laughed at. She stood near the back, didn't announce herself, didn't need to. 5'5", dark hair pulled back so tight it looked like it hurt, a thermos of coffee held in both hands, like a small fire she was trying to protect from a wind that hadn't even reached her yet. Her flight suit was sage green regulation, pressed within an inch of its life and completely bare. No patches, no mission tabs. None of the little embroidered, inside jokes every other pilot in that room wore, stitched across their shoulders, like medals earned in bar fights and near misses. She looked like she'd wandered in from administration. She hadn't. Her name was Reese Calder, 27 years old, new transfer, and in about 4 minutes this room was going to decide it already knew everything worth knowing about her. They were wrong. They didn't know that yet, which was, in its own way, the entire point of this particular morning. Commander Elias Bragg walked in first, a folder tucked under one arm, silence trailing behind him like an obedient dog that had learned a long time ago exactly how far it was allowed to wander. He was the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he'd never once needed to. Every pilot in that room had discovered at some point, usually the hard way, that Bragg's quiet was significantly worse than anyone else's shouting. He set the folder down, didn't open it yet. Morning. A ripple of half-awake grunts answered him. Somebody near the front was still working on their second cup of coffee, like it was a personal grievance against the day. We've got a new addition to the roster. Bragg's eyes swept the rows until they landed near the back. Transferred in from Edwards. Captain Reese Calder. Heads turned, slow at first. Then all at once the way a herd turns when it senses something's off in the grass, even before it fully understands what. Edwards. That word did something to a room full of frontline fighter pilots. It always did. Edwards meant test pilot school. Meant labs and telemetry streams, and men in white coats hovering behind a headset, murmuring, pull up, you're outside the envelope, while some poor pilot tried to keep an experimental airframe from tearing itself apart at 40,000 feet. To combat pilots, test pilots were a different species entirely. Smart, careful, soft, or so the theory went, though nobody in that room had ever actually flown alongside one long enough to test the theory properly. Bragg glanced at the smartboard behind him. We're syncing the tactical network for today's patrol. He looked toward the back of the room. Captain, call sign for the transponder. Reese stepped forward. Falcon, sir. The room went quiet. Then it didn't. Major Grady Holt sat dead center of the second row, built like a linebacker, who'd wandered into an aviator's life by accident and decided, somewhere along the way, that he liked it too much to leave. His call sign was Bulldog, earned, or so the story went, after a minor taxiing collision early in his career, that he'd since polished into a legend of near-heroic proportions. The kind of story that grew a little in every telling until nobody, including Holt himself, entirely remembered what had actually happened. Beside him, Captain Owen Pratt Icebox mirrored every twitch of Holt's expression, like a man who had, at some point, quietly agreed to stop generating original opinions of his own. Holt let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, the kind that handed the entire room permission to do the same, and the laughter caught fast, rolling outward in waves, gathering strength the way laughter does when everybody's relieved to have something easy to laugh at before the sun's even up, because that was the unwritten law of a fighter squadron. Call signs weren't chosen, they were earned, usually through humiliation. A busted landing immortalized forever in the retelling. A dumb mistake that followed you for the rest of your career, whether you liked it or not. Nobody simply walked into a briefing room and announced a name like Falcon like it already belonged to them. Falcon? Holt twisted fully around in his chair to face her, grinning wide enough to show teeth. Like the bird, or you just really like Star Wars, Captain? Should we be watching the scope for Imperial cruisers today? More laughter. Somebody in the third row added a comment about radar signatures that landed well with the room and badly with everyone actually trying to run a professional briefing. Bragg's jaw tightened. He didn't step in, because this was tradition, hazing the new transfer, a pressure test disguised as comedy, the kind every pilot in that room had survived at some point in their own careers, which was exactly why none of them saw a reason to spare her from it now. Reese didn't flush, didn't look away. She simply found Holt's eyes and held them, flat still, the kind of stillness that unsettled people far more than shouting ever managed to. Just Falcon, Major. Her voice was quiet enough that the room had to lean in to catch it, and that quiet did something the laughter hadn't. It cut straight through it, clean and sudden, like a hand closing around a ringing bell. Holt shook his head, grin faltering for exactly 1 second, before he covered it with another laugh, louder, this time, a little too deliberate. Whatever you say. Just try to keep up today. Heavy patrol out to the Bering. Weather's turning into a real bastard, and we don't have time to hold a rookie's hand. Noted. She took a slow sip of coffee, didn't blink. Bragg cleared his throat loud enough to reclaim the room. Enough. Mission profile. And just like that, the show was over. Everyone turned back toward the front. Everyone except Reese, whose eyes stayed forward while her thoughts went somewhere none of them could reach. Because she'd heard worse, much worse, and laughter, cheap, easy, thoughtless laughter from men who had never once had their aircraft fall out from under them at 40,000 feet, wasn't the kind of thing that could touch her anymore. Not after everything she'd already survived to get here. Not after everything that had happened before she'd even learned to fly. She'd been 11 years old the first time she understood, really understood, what it meant to love someone whose job was to fly machines that occasionally killed the people who flew them. Her father used to sit on the edge of her bed some nights, still half in his flight suit, smelling faintly of jet fuel and cold air, and tell her stories that weren't quite bedtime stories. Stories about clouds that looked solid enough to walk on, about the particular blue that existed only above 30,000 feet, a blue so deep it didn't seem to belong to the same sky she saw from the ground. The sky's a conversation, he used to tell her, not a job, a conversation. You go up, you listen to what it's telling you, and if you're paying attention, it lets you come back down again. She hadn't understood what he meant, not really, not at 11. She'd understood it much later, and by then it had cost her something enormous to finally understand it at all, because Colonel Thomas Calder had been, by every account she'd ever gathered from mechanics, from fellow pilots, from the handful of instructors who'd trained under him before his death, one of the finest natural pilots the Air Force had produced in a generation. Not the loudest, not the most decorated, though the decorations existed, filed away now in a box her mother kept in a closet, neither of them opened very often. The best, the kind of effortless instinctive skill that made other pilots go quiet when they watched him fly. The way a room goes quiet around a musician who plays without appearing to try at all. And then, on an ordinary training flight over open desert, something in his aircraft had failed catastrophically. He had not walked away from it. The inquiry that followed had taken 3 months to produce a report that fit onto 4 pages and closed with 2 words that had rewritten the rest of Reese Calder's childhood before she'd even turned 14. Pilot error. 2 words. A man who had never once, in 20 years of flying, made a careless mistake in the air, reduced to a phrase that fit neatly on an official form. Filed, stamped, closed. She still had the report, folded soft at the creases now, worn thin from being opened and closed and opened again more times than she could count. It rode with her, through flight school, through every posting, every deployment, tucked into the same inside pocket of her flight bag, where it had traveled for the better part of a decade, not because she needed to read it anymore, but because carrying it felt like carrying him, in whatever small, stubborn way still remained available to her. She'd built her entire adult life, in some sense, around proving those 2 words wrong. Flight school first, then selection for advanced fighter training, where she'd graduated at the top of a class that hadn't expected much from the quiet woman in the back row. Then, eventually, a black program out of Edwards that had pushed the outer limits of what an aircraft and a human body could survive together, testing experimental airframes in conditions no sane engineer would have signed off on if the stakes had been quite so high. She hadn't done it for glory. She'd done it because somewhere along the way, without ever quite deciding to, she'd made herself into the kind of pilot who could look directly at the worst version of an emergency and not blink. Because if she could survive what her father supposedly couldn't, then maybe it would prove, finally and completely, that whatever had happened to him hadn't been his fault at all. She hadn't found proof yet. Not real proof, just fragments. A retired mechanic who'd mentioned once, over a beer he probably regretted buying her, that there'd been some funny business with a parts batch around the time of her father's accident, before catching himself and changing the subject entirely. A footnote in an old engineering bulletin that never quite connected to anything solid enough to act on. Small pieces of a much larger picture she'd spent 14 years trying and failing to fully assemble. She hadn't stopped looking. She'd just learned, the hard way, how to keep looking quietly, how to carry an entire investigation folded into the smallest possible space, tucked behind a professional composure so complete that almost nobody who met her ever suspected it existed at all. Almost nobody. Sitting in that briefing room, listening to Grady Holt make jokes about imperial cruisers, she let herself feel, for exactly 1 second, the old familiar ache behind her ribs. Then she folded it away, the same way she folded everything else, and turned her attention back to the mission at hand. Because there wasn't time for grief today. There was a patrol, 4 hours of babysitting an AWACS crew over open water, and pretending she couldn't feel two pilots' eyes rolling behind her back the entire time. The mission itself was simple on paper. It always was, on paper. A modified E3 Sentry, call sign Warden 1, would run deep radar sweeps along the maritime border, hunting for an uptick in submarine activity that intelligence kept flagging without anyone quite managing to confirm it. Because the sentry was slow, unarmed, and worth more to an enemy than an entire squadron of fighters combined, 3 F-22 Raptors would fly escort. Holt would lead. Bulldog 1. Pratt would fly his wing. Bulldog 2. Reese would fly slot. Bulldog 3. As the room broke apart, pilots filing out toward the life support lockers in 2s and 3s, Holt made a point of brushing his shoulder against hers on the way past. Eyes on your instruments today, Falcon. His voice dropped low, meant only for her. The performance of the briefing room shed now that the audience had thinned. This isn't a test track in sunny California. You lose focus up here, the sky swallows you whole. Reese didn't break stride. She adjusted the zipper at her collar and kept walking, because she'd learned a long time ago that the men who needed to prove something the loudest were rarely the ones worth answering. She knew exactly why she'd earned the name Falcon. She just wasn't going to hand that knowledge to a room that had already decided, before she'd said a single additional word, to laugh at her instead of listen. 3 weeks earlier, on the day she'd arrived at Wolfhaven, Colonel Edwin Voss had personally walked her through the base. She remembered it clearly, remembered the easy warmth in his voice, the way he'd shaken her hand a beat too long, the way his eyes had crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the kind of smile that made people relax around him without quite understanding why. Calder, he'd said, glancing down at her file. I knew a Calder once. Good man. Damn shame what happened to him. She'd gone very still, the way she always did whenever a stranger mentioned her father without knowing exactly who they were talking to. You knew him, sir. Came up together, Voss had said, something briefly unreadable, crossing his face before the warmth returned, smoothing it back over. Different assignments, but we crossed paths more than a few times. Fine pilot. Terrible loss. She'd thanked him, said something appropriately professional, filed the moment away without giving it much additional weight, because grief made people say all sorts of things they didn't fully mean, and condolences from a stranger 3 weeks into a new posting weren't exactly rare. She hadn't thought about it again, not until much later, though standing in that locker room 3 weeks after the fact, checking straps and pouches with the same methodical calm she brought to everything. Some small, unexamined part of her filed the memory away again anyway, the way she filed away everything that didn't yet have anywhere else to go. The locker room was colder than the briefing room, colder than it had any right to be given the heating vents rattling somewhere overhead that clearly weren't accomplishing much of anything. Reese sat on the bench alone, methodical, the way she did everything. First the G-suit, tight against her legs, her abdomen, built to keep blood from pooling in her lower body when the world tried to crush her sideways at 9 times gravity. Then the survival vest, beacon, radio, cold weather kit. Because up here, the ocean below could stop a human heart in under 3 minutes, and nobody flying this patrol was foolish enough to forget it, no matter how routine the mission profile claimed to be. Her hands moved without her full permission, tightening straps, checking pouches, running through a checklist etched so deep into muscle memory it didn't require conscious thought anymore, which was good, because her thoughts, as always, drifted somewhere else in the quiet. She thought about her mother, and, back in a small house outside Colorado Springs, who had stopped talking about her husband years ago, not because the grief had faded, but because grief with nowhere left to go eventually just goes quiet instead, folding itself into the corners of a life, the way dust settles into a room nobody bothers to clean anymore. She thought about the box in the closet, the decorations, the photographs nobody had put back up on the walls. She thought unwillingly about the exact sound of Voss's voice 3 weeks earlier. Fine pilot. Terrible loss. Stop. Not today. She zipped the vest shut with more force than strictly necessary, the small motion enough to snap her attention back into the present. Today was a patrol. Today was 4 hours of formation flying and radio discipline, and pretending she couldn't feel two pilots rolling their eyes behind her, back the entire time. The rest, the report, the batch numbers, the 14 years of quiet, careful searching that would keep. It always had. She grabbed her helmet, tucked it under one arm, and walked out into the cold before her thoughts could wander any further down that particular runway. The flight line hit her like a wall the second the door opened. 15 below, and the wind carried an edge sharp enough to bite straight through the parka she wore over her flight suit for the walk out. The sky overhead was a pale, bruised purple, heavy, waiting, the way it always seemed to wait up here, like the weather itself understood something the pilots hadn't figured out yet. Lined up on the tarmac, the 3 F-22 Raptors sat like predators that had simply chosen, for the moment, to hold still. Radar-absorbent skin the color of wet slate, even motionless, even silent. They looked like something built to hunt, engineered down to the smallest rivet for exactly one purpose. A young crew chief stood near the nose of her assigned jet, breath pluming in thick white clouds, stamping his boots against the cold. Airman First Class Wesley Tate couldn't have been more than 22, still had that eager, faintly nervous energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to fake indifference the way the veterans had, the kind of earnestness that made him easy to like and easy, sometimes, to overlook. "Morning, Captain." His voice cracked slightly on the second word, the cold or the nerves or both. Jets fueled, armed, pre-flights green across the board. "She's a good bird." "Thank you, Airman." Reese began her walk-around, methodical, unhurried, the way she approached every pre-flight inspection, treating each aircraft the way her father had always treated his own, not as a machine to be operated, but as a partner in an ongoing negotiation with physics that deserved to be taken seriously. She ran a gloved hand along the leading edge of the wing, checked the landing gear struts, visually inspected the massive thrust, vectoring nozzles at the rear, watching for anything that looked even slightly out of place. She paused at the intake, something small, a maintenance tag, half-tucked behind a panel, easy to miss, unless you were looking for exactly that kind of thing. She wasn't looking for it, not really. It was habit, the leftover instinct of a test pilot trained to notice what didn't belong, the same instinct that had once saved her life on an aircraft nobody else believed could be saved. She pulled it free, turned it over, a serial number, and something about it snagged in her memory. Not clearly, not immediately, just a small, cold pull at the back of her mind, like a name she almost recognized but couldn't quite place, the way a familiar face sometimes surfaces in a crowd before you've consciously registered whose face it belongs to. "Everything okay, Captain?" Tate's voice, hesitant from a few feet away. She looked at the number a second longer, filed it away, because there wasn't time to chase a feeling right now, not with a mission clock already counting down, and because feelings weren't evidence, and evidence was the only thing that had ever mattered in this particular hunt. "Fine." She clipped the tag back into place, just being thorough. Tate nodded, relieved, and stepped back to give her room, though something in his shoulders stayed slightly tense a moment longer than it needed to, because Tate had a small, uneasy feeling of his own one he hadn't yet found the words or the courage to voice to anyone. 2 weeks earlier, running a routine borescope inspection on that exact engine, he'd noticed something he hadn't liked, a faint discoloration along one of the turbine blades, subtle enough that it hadn't triggered any automated fault flag, but present enough that it had made him pause, made him take a second look, made him consider, briefly, flagging it for a deeper inspection before his shift supervisor had waved him along toward the next aircraft on a schedule that didn't leave much room for hunches. He'd let it go, told himself it was nothing, told himself the automated systems would catch anything that actually mattered, because that was what they were designed to do, and because questioning a system that had passed every checklist felt less like diligence and more like overstepping. He hadn't said anything, and now, watching Captain Calder climb the yellow ladder toward the cockpit of that same aircraft, he felt the uneasy feeling sharpen slightly, the way a small worry sometimes does, right before it turns into something you wish you'd acted on sooner. He still didn't say anything. There wasn't time. And besides, what would he even say? I noticed a smudge on a turbine blade 2 weeks ago and decided it probably wasn't important. It sounded foolish even inside his own head, so he stepped back, watched the canopy hum shut, and told himself, one more time, that it was probably nothing. Inside the cockpit, Reese settled into that narrow, glowing world of glass displays and amber light, the smell of avionics and cooling fans and jet fuel settling around her like something close to comfort. She began the startup sequence, fingers moving fast, practiced. Thousands of hours distilled into muscle memory that didn't need her conscious mind to function, freeing that part of her attention for everything else that never quite stopped running underneath the surface. Deep in the belly of the jet, the auxiliary power unit screamed to life. Then the twin engines, rumbling up through the airframe, through the seat, into her bones, a sound she'd loved since childhood. Since the first time her father had taken her to an air show and let her stand close enough to feel a formation flyby in her chest instead of just her ears. Wolfhaven Tower, Bulldog Flight, requesting taxi. Holt's voice crackled back, dripping with the same lazy authority he wore like a second skin, the performance of command settling comfortably over him the moment his own canopy closed. Bulldog Flight, cleared to taxi. Winds out of the north, 20 knots, gusting 30. She eased the throttle forward. 60,000 pounds of aircraft rolled out of its parking spot, falling into line behind the other two Raptors, 3 shadows gliding across frost-glazed concrete like something out of a dream. Nobody in that briefing room deserved to have. Bulldog Flight, check in. Bulldog 2 green, Pratt answered. Bulldog 3 green, Reese said. All right, boys. Holt's voice, still open on the tactical channel, still pitched loud enough for her to catch every word. We punch through this cloud deck, form up on Warden 1, and babysit the radar nerds for 4 hours. Keep it tight, Falcon. Try not to get lost in the soup. She said nothing, because the jab wasn't worth the breath, and because there was a runway, and because there was a runway ahead of her, and because in less than a minute she'd be somewhere no voice on that radio could reach her. Cleared for takeoff. Holt and Pratt went first, afterburners igniting into twin pillars of white-blue fire that roared off the mountains and rattled every window on base. 10 seconds later, it was her turn. She pushed the throttles into the detent. The acceleration hit like a fist. 35,000 pounds of thrust per engine, shoving her back into the seat, the frozen runway smearing into a gray blur beneath her. At 150 knots, she eased back on the stick. The Raptor left the earth. Within seconds, she punched through the low cloud layer into a world of blinding white, then broke free into a sky so blue and so wide it looked almost merciful. Below her, an ocean of clouds stretched to every horizon, catching the low morning light in shades of pink and gold that no camera had ever quite managed to capture properly. Bulldog 3, form up on my right wing, Holt ordered. Copy. She slid the jet into position, 20 feet off his wingtip, the movement so clean and so instinctive, it barely registered as effort. Ahead, the E-3 Sentry cruised steady and slow, its iconic radar dome turning in lazy circles above the fuselage, like the eye of something very old and very patient, watching the water below for a threat that may or may not have actually existed. For the first 2 hours, the mission was exactly as advertised. Mundane. They flew a wide, sweeping orbit near the edge of American airspace, the temperature gauge on her display reading 65 below outside the canopy. Over the radio, Holt and Pratt filled the silence with football scores and weekend plans in Anchorage, occasionally letting a comment drift her way, sharp enough to sting, casual enough to deny later if she ever pushed back. Hey Falcon, Pratt's voice static fuzzed. You ever flown anything faster than a desk before this? Radio discipline. Bulldog 2, she said, flat as glass. Holt chuckled. Let her be, Icebox. She's concentrating real hard on not hitting the wrong button. Reese kept her eyes on the radar display, checked her fuel state, scanned the horizon out of habit rather than necessity. Because the banter was noise, meaningless noise. She'd flown through anti-aircraft fire, in places she wasn't allowed to name out loud, over deserts that had tried much harder than 2 bored fighter jocks ever could to kill her. Their fragile egos didn't even register on the same scale as the things she'd already survived. But her mind kept drifting back to that serial number. Small, half-hidden, familiar in a way she couldn't yet explain. She pulled up the maintenance log on her secondary display, scrolling through component history out of nothing more than restlessness. The kind of restlessness that had served her well in the past. The kind that had once saved her life when everyone around her had insisted nothing was wrong. Turbine assembly, replaced 8 months ago, sourced from surplus inventory, batch number. She stared at it, and something cold moved through her chest, slow and quiet, the way ice forms on still water, not all at once, but in a spreading pattern you don't notice until the whole surface has already changed underneath you. She'd seen that batch number before, not on this aircraft. On a report she'd read 100 times, a report with her father's name at the top of it, a report that had used the phrase pilot error to close a case that, in her opinion, an opinion built over 14 years of quiet, careful investigation, should never have been closed at all. Her hand tightened slightly on the stick. Coincidence? She told herself that, tried to, because component reuse across a fleet this size wasn't rare. Because paranoia dressed up as intuition was exactly the kind of thing that got pilots killed by making them doubt working systems instead of watching for actual failures. Because she'd learned, the hard way, more than once, that grief liked to disguise itself as certainty. Except the number matched. Not close, not similar, matched. And she'd spent 14 years learning that the difference between a coincidence and a pattern was usually just a matter of how many data points you were willing to collect before you finally let yourself see it clearly. Bulldog 3, you're drifting. Holt's voice snapped through the channel, mildly annoyed. Tighten up. She corrected instantly, sliding back into formation, her hands steady even as her thoughts kept circling that batch number like a hawk that hadn't yet decided whether the movement below it was prey or something far more dangerous. Not now. She locked it away, filed it beside every other fragment of evidence she'd gathered over the years. In the mental archive she'd built specifically for this purpose, because the sky did not forgive a distracted pilot, and there would be time later, on the ground, in the quiet, to pull the thread and see how far it unraveled. For now there was a mission, a formation to hold, a patrol to fly. She didn't know yet how little time later would actually give her Falcon. Holt's voice again, quieter this time, almost without the usual edge. You've been quiet. Radio discipline. Bulldog 1, she said. Isn't that the rule? A short pause. Then, grudgingly, something that might have been the beginning of respect. Copy that. It didn't last, because a beat later, Pratt's voice cut back in, laced with its usual smirk. Bet she's back there doing math. Test pilots love their math. I'm monitoring engine performance, Bulldog 2, Reese said flatly. You might try it sometime. There was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, a short laugh from Holt, genuine this time, not mocking. She's got you there, icebox. Reese allowed herself the smallest flicker of something like satisfaction. It didn't last either, because that was the exact moment the vibration started. It began as a feeling more than a sound, a deep, sub-audible hum, working its way up through the rudder pedals, into the soles of her boots, out of rhythm with the smooth, synchronized purr the twin engines were supposed to maintain. Her eyes snapped to the display. The fan speed indicator for the right engine flickered, dropped 2%, spiked 3, dropped again. Compressor stall, she thought, her mind shifting instantly, the way it always did in moments like this, analytical, precise, stripped of everything except the problem directly in front of her. Her hand moved toward the throttle, and somewhere behind that motion, quiet but unmistakable, one final thought surfaced before the world tore itself apart. It's the same batch. It's the same defect. This is what killed him. She didn't reach the throttle in time, because deep inside the engine casing, the fracture that had been growing quietly for months finally surrendered to the physics of 30,000 revolutions per minute. The titanium fan blade sheared clean off its hub. At that speed, it became shrapnel. It tore through the surrounding blades in a fraction of a second, triggering a cascading failure that ripped through the entire compressor section like something starving finally being fed. The explosion that followed was violently concussive. A deafening bang tore through the cockpit, rattling her teeth in her skull. The aircraft yawed hard to the right, thrown off balance by the sudden asymmetrical loss of power, fighting to flip itself upside down. A massive ball of orange and black fire erupted from the rear of the jet, trailing thick smoke across a sky that, seconds ago, had been almost peaceful. Every alarm the aircraft owned went off at once. Master caution. Engine fire right, hydraulics fault, generator fail. Beep, beep, beep. Jesus. Pratt's voice breaking wide open with panic, static crackling as he yanked his own jet into a hard climb to avoid the debris field. Holt, she's hit. Bulldog 3 is on fire. Holt banked sharply, straining to look back, and what he saw drained the color out of every ounce of arrogance he'd carried into that briefing room hours earlier. A trail of black smoke, thick and violent, pouring off the right side of Reese Calder's aircraft. Bulldog 3, Mayday, Mayday. Holt's voice cracked, panic finally stripping away the swagger. Falcon, your right engine's gone. You've got structural fire, bail out. Punch out right now. Inside the cockpit, Reese fought a jet that had turned into something feral, bucking, snapping toward an uncontrolled spin. The loss of the right engine had crippled her primary hydraulic system, turning the controls thick and sluggish under her hands, every input costing twice the effort it should have. Warning lights painted the inside of her visor in strobes of red. Any pilot who hadn't spent years deliberately putting broken aircraft into uncontrollable spins just to see whether they could be pulled back from the edge would have already been reaching for the ejection handle between their legs. She didn't reach for it, because in the 2 seconds it took her mind to process the disaster unfolding around her, something in her shifted not into fear, but past it, into the strange, focused calm she'd trained herself to find precisely for moments like this one. She didn't see fire. She saw a physics problem, one that demanded an immediate, aggressive, correct answer. And underneath that focus, quiet but absolutely certain now, one final realization settled into place, cold and clear as the sky she'd broken through less than 3 hours earlier. This is the same failure that killed him, and somebody let it happen again. There wasn't time to feel what that meant. Not yet. Not with the jet trying to kill her in the next 10 seconds, regardless of what had caused the failure in the first place. Her hands moved. Fast. Certain. Left rudder stomped to the floor. Stick forward and left, fighting the heavy, unresponsive controls with everything her arms had left to give. Negative. Bulldog 1, she said, and her voice, impossibly, came out steady, flat, almost eerily calm against the chaos filling every other channel on the frequency. I have the aircraft. Clear the airspace below me. I'm bringing her down. Silence answered her. 5 full seconds of it, heavy enough to feel like its own kind of pressure, while Holt and Pratt tried and failed to process what they'd just heard. Because 40,000 feet above the Bering Sea, a $60 million apex predator of the sky had just started behaving like a wounded, dying bird, and the woman they'd laughed at 8 hours earlier was the only thing standing between that bird and the ocean waiting to swallow it whole. Reese Calder gripped the stick with both hands, the pain in her shoulders already sharpening to something that would matter later, if there was a later, and forced her focus down to a single, narrow point. Fly the jet. Just fly the jet. Everything else can wait. Everything else, the mockery, the batch number, the report folded soft with age in her flight bag, the 14 years of quiet, careful searching that had somehow, impossibly, led her straight into this exact moment. All of it would have to wait. Because right now, there was only the sky, and the fire, and the terrifying, focused silence in her own chest that had carried her through worse than this before. She just prayed, in the small, unspoken way she allowed herself to pray, that it would be enough to carry her through it one more time. And somewhere far below, on a runway she couldn't yet see through the smoke pouring past her canopy, the answer to 14 years of unanswered questions was already waiting for her, closer now than it had ever been, and far more dangerous than she'd ever let herself imagine. The jet was still trying to kill her. That was the only thought that mattered now. Not the mockery in the briefing room, not the batch number burning a hole through the back of her mind, not her father's name sitting quietly beneath everything else like a stone at the bottom of a lake. Just this, just the next 3 seconds. Then the 3 after that. Fire suppression. She reached forward, punched the button. Halon gas flooded into the ruptured engine bay, smothering flame with chemical silence. The right throttle dead already, severed of fuel, useless. She snapped fully closed anyway. Muscle memory demanding completion, even when the outcome no longer mattered. The way a body keeps running for a few extra steps after the mind has already accepted the fall. Left rudder to the floor, stick forward, left. Fighting hydraulics gone thick and sluggish. Every inch of control surface costing double what it should, like arm wrestling a machine that had decided, somewhere in the last 4 seconds, that it no longer wanted to cooperate with the person flying it. The nose sliced right fought her. She fought back, override. Her thumb found the paddle switch at the base of the stick and pressed it flat, disengaging the flight computer's protections in one motion. Because the computer didn't understand what was happening to this airframe, and she did. Give me direct control. Give me the airplane, not the argument. The jet answered, sluggish, furious, but answering. The horizon on her HUD, spinning wild seconds ago, began slowly, terribly slowly to steady. Falcon status. Talk to me. Holt's voice raw, no trace left of the man who'd mocked her 8 hours earlier, just fear now. Human fear stripped down to its studs, engine fires out. Her own voice came back flat, robotic almost, because that was the only way to keep it steady. Strip every emotion out of the sentence before it left her mouth. Right engine's a total loss. Structural damage to the right empennage. Flight controls are sluggish. Responding, a beat of static. Then Pratt somewhere above and to the left, voice cracking wide open. She caught it. She actually Holt. She pulled it out of the spin. Below them, 30 miles out. The AWACS orbited in slow, tense circles, its crew staring at a transponder ping that had, seconds earlier, looked like it belonged to something already dying. Inside the fuselage of Warden 1, the mood had shifted from the low, practiced hum of a routine patrol into something closer to a held breath. Radar operators leaned into their screens. Someone had gone very quiet at the coffee station near the rear bulkhead, a half-powered cup forgotten in one hand. Bulldog flight, this is Warden 1. The controller's voice, Colonel Ruth Callahan, 41 years old, 2 decades in and out of headsets. Calm because the job demanded calm, even when nothing underneath the calm felt calm at all. We have visual on your telemetry. You're dropping fast. Recommend immediate ejection. Water's 32 degrees. Coast Guard scrambling out of the coastal station now. Negative, Warden 1. Reese's answer came instantly. No hesitation in it. If I punch out into that cloud deck, I freeze before the chute even opens. I'm staying with the aircraft. Give me a vector to the nearest divert strip. A pause on the line. The kind of pause that meant someone on the other end was doing math they didn't like the answer to. Falcon, you're 200 miles from the mainland. Wolfhaven's out of the question. You won't make it. I'm not asking for Wolfhaven, Colonel. Something sharpened in Reese's voice, now the first real edge she'd let slip all day. Pull your diversion charts. Give me a heading to Harrow Station. Holt's head snapped toward his own display. Harrow? Falcon, that's a Cold War rock in the middle of nowhere, barely maintained. And it's sitting right inside that storm cell. It's got a 10,000-foot runway built for bombers that don't exist anymore. Reese fired back, eyes scanning her failing systems even as she spoke, and it's 80 miles off my left wing. I don't have the altitude or the hydraulic pressure to reach the mainland. It's Harrow or the ocean. Give me the vector. 1 second. 2. Vector 240, Callahan said quietly. Distance 82 miles. Godspeed, Falcon. Reese banked the dying jet southwest. The airframe groaned, protesting the turn, every seam and rivet complaining about a maneuver it had no business surviving. Below her, the pristine blue sky vanished, swallowed whole by a churning gray wall of storm. She was descending at 3,000 feet a minute. 15 minutes. That was the number that surfaced in her head, cold and precise, the kind of arithmetic her body did automatically now, after years of training herself to calculate exactly how much time remained before a decision stopped being optional. 15 minutes to glide a crippled, unaerodynamic slab of titanium through a blinding winter storm, on failing instruments, with a hydraulic system bleeding out into freezing air 1 drop at a time. 15 minutes. Okay, fly the jet, everything else waits. Except her mind, treacherous even now, kept sliding sideways toward the thing she'd told it to leave alone. The batch number. The report folded soft in her flight bag. 14 years of quiet searching that had, somehow, in the space of 4 terrifying seconds, stopped being a mystery and started being a fact she hadn't yet found the words for. Not now. Fly the jet. You can fall apart later, if there is a later. Aboard Warden 1, the cabin had gone from routine tedium to controlled chaos in under 90 seconds. Radar operators hunched over consoles, voices low and clipped, coordinating with Anchorage Center to sweep every scrap of civilian traffic out of the corridor ahead of Bulldog 3. Colonel Ruth Callahan stood behind them, one hand braced on the back of a chair, waiting for a secure line to finish routing through to Air Combat Command. She needed authorization, fast. Harrow Station wasn't open to standard traffic, hadn't been in years. Landing a severely damaged, highly classified F-22 there meant breaking about 4 different regulations simultaneously, and Callahan had exactly zero interest in being the officer who let a pilot die because of paperwork nobody would even remember signing a decade from now. The screen flickered, resolved into the stern, weathered face of Lieutenant General Harlan Foster. "General, we have a Class A emergency over the Bering." Callahan's voice stayed level through sheer force of will. Bulldog 3 suffered an uncontained engine failure. Pilots attempting a dead-stick glide to Harrow. "I need base command to bring their instrument landing system online." "Now, who's the pilot?" Foster's voice, sharp, immediate. "Captain Reese Calder. Call sign Falcon." Something shifted behind Foster's eyes. He turned away from the camera for a moment, typed something onto a terminal Callahan couldn't see. His shoulders, visible even through the low-resolution feed, seemed to tighten around something private, something that had nothing to do with the emergency currently unfolding. Everything to do with a name that clearly meant more to him than the file in front of him could explain. When he turned back, the bureaucratic weight had drained out of his expression entirely, replaced by something rigid, focused. Almost though Callahan wouldn't have used the word out loud. "Afraid, Colonel," Foster said slowly. "Are Bulldog 1 and 2 currently flying escort for Captain Calder?" "Yes, sir. On her wing. Patch my audio directly to their tactical frequency. Override their local comms." A technician's hands flew across a panel. "You're live with Bulldog Flight, General." High above the storm, Holt and Pratt were flying close enough to see the charred, jagged metal peeling back from the ruined engine nacelle on Reese's jet. Close enough to watch the smoke trail thin and thicken with every gust that tore at her airframe. Static burst across the channel. Then, a voice neither of them expected. "Bulldog 1. Bulldog 2. This is General Foster. Air Combat Command." His tone left no room for argument. "Listen carefully. You are currently escorting an asset of extraordinary value. You will do exactly what Captain Calder tells you to do. You will not question her. You will not second-guess her." Holt keyed his mic, confusion warring openly with panic. "General, sir, respectfully, she's a transfer from Edwards. She's bleeding hydraulic fluid and trying to fly a crippled jet into a blizzard. We need to order her to eject." "Major Holt." Foster's voice cracked across the radio like a whip. "You will hold your tongue. Captain Calder is not a rookie. Your squadron commander was never cleared to read her full file." A pause, deliberate, heavy with everything about to follow. "You want to know why she's called Falcon?" Holt and Pratt fell silent. Even Reese, fighting to hold the nose of her aircraft level through a widening gap between control input and control response, went unnaturally still for exactly 1 second, because she hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected the Air Force to strip away 14 years of careful, deliberate privacy in the middle of an active emergency, on an open channel, in front of the 2 men who'd spent the entire morning laughing at her. 3 years ago, Foster continued, Captain Calder was the lead test pilot on a joint program between the Air Force and a classified aerospace division. But that's not what matters right now. Another pause, longer this time. 2 years ago, over contested airspace, she was flying an experimental variant when the tail section suffered a total structural failure. Engineers on that program testified, under oath, that the failure was unsurvivable. There was no scenario in their models where the aircraft came home. Pratt's breath caught, audible even through the static. Every fighter pilot in the Air Force had heard some version of the story. A ghosted, a tailless aircraft that should have been a smoking hole in the ground somewhere, and instead had somehow, impossibly, Come home. The kind of story that got told in officers' clubs after too many drinks. Half legend, half rumor, nobody quite sure how much of it was true. She didn't eject, Foster said quietly. She flew that aircraft for 40 miles with no working flight computer, landed it, walked away, and asked for a cup of coffee. Holt stared through his canopy at the ruined, smoking jet flying off his right wing. The woman he'd laughed at 8 hours ago. The quiet one. The one with no patches, no swagger, no history he'd bothered to ask about, because he'd already decided the way men like him always decided, fast and wrong exactly who she was. The second she'd said her call sign out loud, he'd been catastrophically mistaken. So, Major Holt. Foster's voice softened, just slightly, just enough to carry something almost like respect underneath the command. If Captain Calder tells you she can put that dying aircraft down on Harrow Station, you make damn sure you stay out of her way, and you help her find that runway. Copy that, General. Holt's voice came out stripped of every ounce of the swagger he'd carried into the briefing room. We've got her back. The channel opened again. Foster's voice softer now, directed at Reese herself. Falcon, this is Foster. Runway lights at Harrow are coming online. Bring her home, Captain. Working on it, sir. Reese's voice came back strained, fighting another violent shudder rattling up through the airframe. But I've got a problem. I just lost my primary navigational computer. Radar's out, she was flying blind, and the storm below was waiting. She hadn't wanted them to know. That was the thought that kept surfacing, unwelcome, refusing to stay buried underneath the far more urgent problem of keeping 30 tons of broken aircraft pointed in the right direction. 14 years of quiet, gone in 11 seconds, because that was how long it had taken Foster to say it. 11 seconds to unravel something she'd spent over a decade carefully, deliberately protecting, not out of shame, never out of shame, but because the moment people knew what she'd survived, they stopped seeing her. They only saw the story, and she hadn't wanted the story. She'd wanted just once to walk into a room and be judged on nothing but what she did next, except apparently that particular door had just been kicked wide open at the worst possible moment by the one man in the Air Force with the authority to do it, and there wasn't a single thing she could do about that right now except fly the jet and let the rest sort itself out later. If there was a later, there's going to be a later. There has to be, because you still haven't finished what you came here to finish. The turbulence hit without warning, a violent updraft slamming the crippled Raptor sideways, hard enough to throw her against her shoulder harness. Warning tones blared. She silenced the ones she could, ignored the ones she couldn't, and kept her hands locked on a control stick that was starting to feel less like a machine and more like something alive, fighting her every single inch of the way down. At 22,000 feet, they hit the storm. It happened the way it always did, no gradual transition, no warning. 1 second the sky was open and blue and merciless in its clarity. The next, the world outside her canopy simply vanished, swallowed whole by a churning wall of gray that turned the entire windscreen into static. The turbulence hit like a fist. Reese was thrown against her harness hard enough to bruise. The crippled airframe, groaning under stress. It had never been designed to survive in this condition, every gust threatening to tear the last working control surfaces out of her hands entirely. Hydraulic pressure dropping below critical, she reported. Voice tight now, the strain finally starting to bleed through the flatness she'd maintained for the last 10 minutes. Losing authority on the left aileron. Trims maxed out. I'm right here with you, Falcon. Holt's voice, steady close. His jet mere feet from hers, close enough that his silhouette became the only fixed point in a world that had otherwise dissolved into gray chaos. Use me as your horizon. Don't look at the clouds. Look at my wingtip. Copy icebox, drop back, run radar sweep. Keep our glide path clear, Holt ordered. On it, Pratt answered, peeling away into the storm. Inside the cockpit, the temperature outside hovered near 40 below. But the real crisis was closer than that. The environmental control system, powered in large part by the engine that no longer existed, was failing fast. Ice began creeping across the canopy glass in thin, spidering lines, rapidly thickening into something opaque. Canopy's icing, Reese said, reaching for the manual defroster toggle, even though some cold, analytical part of her mind already knew it wouldn't matter. Not without engine bleed air to power it. Holt, I'm going blind in here. No HUD symbology, backup attitude indicators lagging. Just focus on my wingtip, Reese. Something in his voice had changed completely, the arrogance stripped away, replaced by something raw and unguarded. He'd used her first name without seeming to notice. I am your horizon. I am your eyes. Do not look anywhere else. Copy. She locked her gaze onto the single flashing strobe cutting through the gray. Her inner ear screamed that she was inverted, spinning, falling, the vertigo, a physical, nauseating pressure behind her eyes, but she forced herself to trust a light on a stranger's wingtip instead of her own scrambled senses, because that was the only thing keeping her tethered to the sky right now. A stranger's voice, a stranger's wing, and somewhere behind all of it, still burning quietly, that batch number she hadn't yet found the time to fully process. Back at Wolf Haven, the news had already begun tearing through the base the way it always did, not through official channels, but through the dozen unofficial ones that moved faster than any memo ever could. Airman Wesley Tate stood frozen near the flight line operations desk, watching a radar screen he had no clearance to be watching, listening to fragments of radio traffic crackling through an open channel someone had forgotten to close in the chaos of the emergency response. He thought about the maintenance tag, the one he'd watched Captain Calder pull free from behind an intake panel that morning, the one she'd looked at for 1 second too long before clipping it back into place and saying, in a voice that hadn't quite matched her expression, just being thorough. He thought about the discoloration on the turbine blade 2 weeks earlier, the one he'd decided, in the space of about 4 seconds, wasn't worth flagging. He thought about the small, uneasy feeling that had sat in his stomach ever since, one he'd successfully ignored, right up until the moment a radar blip labeled Bulldog 3 began dropping through altitude readings that made his chest go tight enough to hurt. He hadn't said anything that morning, because who was he to question a signed-off maintenance record? Who was he to second-guess a system that had passed every inspection, every checklist, every box that needed checking? Watching that radar blip now, he found himself wishing, quietly and uselessly, that he'd said something anyway, that he'd walked it up the chain. However small it seemed, however foolish it might have sounded coming from a 22-year-old airman with 18 months on the job. He didn't know yet how much that particular regret was about to matter. He just knew it sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold, refusing to move. Aboard Warden 1, Colonel Callahan had pulled up the aircraft's full maintenance record. The moment the emergency call came through, a reflex more than a decision, the kind of instinct that came from decades spent trying to understand failures before anyone finished explaining them out loud. What she found made her sit very still for several seconds. The engine maintenance log, right side, turbine assembly replacement, logged 8 months prior, except the file metadata told a different story than the log entry itself. A modification timestamp, recent, far more recent than 8 months, 48 hours to be exact. Someone had gone into that record and edited it, not added to it, edited it, altered fields, resaved the file, left barely a trace behind, except for the kind of metadata mismatch that only showed up if you were specifically looking for it, which nobody ever was, because nobody ever expected a maintenance record to lie. Callahan felt something cold settle behind her sternum, because a jet didn't just develop a catastrophic engine failure by accident 48 hours after someone had quietly gone in and rewritten its history. That wasn't bad luck, that was concealment. She stared at the screen a moment longer, weighing what she was looking at against everything currently unfolding 82 miles southwest, where a woman was fighting to land a broken aircraft on one wheel through a blizzard that didn't care whether she succeeded or not. Not now. Whatever this was, whoever was responsible, it would have to wait, because right now, the only thing that mattered was getting Reese Calder onto solid ground alive. But Callahan didn't close the file. She saved it, flagged it, locked it under her own credentials so nobody could touch it before she had the chance to look deeper. Because some questions couldn't be unasked once you'd already started asking them. And she had, without quite meaning to, already started. Distance to Harrow, 12 miles. Callahan's voice cut through, steady despite the visible tension threading underneath it. Altitude 4,000. You're on the glide slope, Bulldog 3. but crosswinds at the runway are severe. Sustained 40 knots, gusting 60. Copy, Reese said. Gear coming down. She reached for the landing gear handle on the lower instrument panel, pulled, pushed it down. Beneath the jet, heavy mechanical clunks echoed as the gear doors fought open against the slipstream, the entire aircraft shuddering under the strain. 3 lights. That was all she needed. 3 solid green lights confirming the nose gear and both main gears locked and secured. The nose gear light turned green. The left main gear light turned green. The right main gear, the side where the engine had exploded, where shrapnel had torn through everything in its path, flashed a hard, unblinking red. For a fraction of a second, something in Reese's chest went very still. Halt. Her voice cracked, just slightly. The first real tremor she'd let slip since the explosion. Right main gear indicates unsafe. It didn't lock. Holt dropped his jet lower, sliding beneath her belly to get a visual through the blinding snow. What he saw made something in his stomach drop straight through the floor of his cockpit. The shrapnel hadn't just severed hydraulic lines. It had struck the right landing gear strut directly. The massive titanium wheel hung at a sickening angle, unsecured, useless, a piece of machinery that would collapse instantly under any real weight. Falcon, your right gear's shattered. His voice had gone hollow. It's dangling, it will not hold. The altimeter pinged. 2,000 feet. Terrain. 2 minutes from impact. And through the storm they still couldn't see the island. Couldn't see the runway. Warden 1, this is Bulldog 1. Holt's voice cracked wide with panic. She's got asymmetrical gear failure. Abort the landing. Falcon, you need to eject. Pull the handle. If you touch down like this, that jet's going to flip. I don't have the altitude for a safe ejection. Reese fired back, hands already moving across her panel with a speed that outpaced conscious thought. And the canopy pyros might be frozen solid. I'm committed. Holt, get out of my way. You can't land on one wheel. Watch me. She whispered it. Not a boast. A statement of something colder and steadier than bravado, a kind of unbreakable, terrifying focus she'd built one broken aircraft at a time. Over years, most people never got to see. Inside the cockpit, the world had narrowed to a handful of raw sensory inputs. The canopy was 70% obscured now, a thick white lattice of frost crawling across every inch of glass she needed to see through. She was flying inside what felt like a frozen coffin, plunging through a violent blizzard toward a slab of concrete anchored in the middle of the most hostile stretch of ocean on the continent. Holt, 30 feet off her wing, could see the whole tragedy unfolding in agonizing slow motion. The dangling gear strut, the buffeted, useless wheel, the smoke still curling faintly from what remained of the engine bay. Falcon, listen to me. His voice had shed every trace of rank, every trace of the man who'd mocked her hours earlier. Just a person now, begging another person not to die. You touch down at 150 knots on one wheel. The drag's going to snap that right wing straight into the concrete. You'll cartwheel. It'll shatter into pieces. You have zero margin. I'm aware of the physics, Grady. She used his first name deliberately, cutting straight through his panic with something quieter and steadier. But I know the exact center of gravity on this airframe better than anyone alive. If I can hold the right wing up with aerodynamic pressure until the speed bleeds to 80 knots, I can control the collapse. I need you to talk me down. Be my eyes. A pause. Holt looked at the mangled, smoking wreckage of her engine, at the dangling wheel, at the impossible math she'd just described like it was a routine maneuver, instead of something no simulator had ever modeled. And he remembered what General Foster had told him. The ghost pilot, the tailless aircraft, 40 miles, no flight computer, and a request for coffee at the end of it. If anyone alive could rewrite the rules of aerodynamics in the next 60 seconds, it was the woman in that cockpit. All right. His voice steadied, gripping his own stick until his knuckles went white. I'm on your wing. I'll call your altitude, your lineup. You fly the jet, Reese. Copy. 500 feet. The automated warning system screamed inside her helmet, relentless. Mechanical? Pull up terrain. Pull up. She silenced the master alarm. She needed quiet. Absolute quiet. Because the turbulence over Harrow Station was already legendary among pilots who'd flown near it, a flat rock jutting out of an unforgiving sea, offering no protection from winds that howled straight off open water, with nothing in their path to slow them down. The crosswind slammed into her from the left at a sustained 45 knots, forcing her to fly in a severe crab angle. The nose of the aircraft pointed almost sideways into the wind, just to hold anything resembling a straight line toward a runway she still couldn't see. "You're drifting right." To pace, Holt called, voice a rapid, precise staccato now, every ounce of his usual bravado replaced with something far more useful. "Give me 2 degrees left rudder." "Hold it. Hold it there. You're on the centerline." Left rudder applied. Her jaw was clenched so tight it ached, hydraulic pressures near zero. Controls are turning to concrete, 300 feet. And then, through the blinding curtain of snow, the bright orange strobes of Harrow's runway threshold materialized out of the gloom, glowing like a string of pearls suspended in a sea of milk. "I have the runway lights," Holt shouted. "Dead ahead. They've laid fire-retardant foam, but it's pitching sideways in this wind." "Understood." Her heart beat in a slow, deliberate rhythm against her ribs, not fast, not frantic, just heavy and certain, the way it always went, right before the moment that mattered most. She prepared herself for the hardest maneuver of her life. Somewhere behind her, back at Wolfhaven, the base commander's office sat quiet and lit, a single desk lamp burning against the pre-dawn dark. Colonel Edwin Voss had been awake for most of the night handling routine paperwork nobody else wanted to touch, and he'd been among the first to hear the emergency traffic when it broke across the base's operations net. He'd gone very still at the name, Calder. He'd told himself, in the minutes that followed, that it was simple concern. A pilot on his base, in danger, the kind of thing any commander would feel responsible for. He'd told himself that the tightness in his chest was nothing more than that. He hadn't quite believed himself, because there was a version of this moment he'd been quietly dreading for 14 years, without ever admitting it to another living soul. A moment where a name he'd hoped never to an emergency again crossed his desk anyway, wearing a different face, flying a different aircraft, carrying the exact same defect he'd once decided, in the space of a single signature, was an acceptable risk. He told himself it was a coincidence. He didn't believe that either. He sat at his desk, hands folded, waiting for updates like every other officer on that base, and underneath the waiting, something old and buried, and carefully unexamined for 14 years began, very quietly, to stir. 200 feet, Holt called. 150, flare, Reese, flare now. She pulled back on the stick, raising the nose to bleed off the last of her airspeed, and in the same fraction of a second, slammed her left boot onto the rudder, pedal to straighten the nose while jamming the stick hard left, intentionally flying the jet tilted, balancing 30 tons of broken aircraft on a single wheel like something out of a nightmare no training manual had ever bothered to describe. "Brace," she whispered. The left main tire slammed onto frozen concrete at 142 knots. The impact was bone-jarring, violent enough to rattle her skull inside her helmet. A massive cloud of pulverized snow and ice and fire-retardant foam explode outward around the aircraft, the single tire screaming under a weight it had never been designed to carry alone. "You're down, left wheel only." Holt's voice, pitched high with something between terror and disbelief, as he pitched his own jet up and away to avoid the collision. "Hold the wing up." "Reese, hold it." Inside the cockpit, it felt like the jet was being torn apart by something enormous and unseen. The crosswind clawed at the fuselage, dragging relentlessly toward the edge of the runway. Her left arm stayed locked and rigid, forcing the aileron to fight for every inch of lift, keeping the shattered right wing suspended above the concrete. 120 knots. She tapped the brake gently, terrified of locking the wheel and sending the entire aircraft into an uncontrolled ground loop that would kill her just as certainly as the fire would have. 100 knots. The physics were decaying now, exactly the way she'd known they would. Lesser speed meant less air over the wings, less lift. The left aileron's authority bleeding away with every passing second, the dead weight of the missing engine, and the collapsed landing gear finally beginning to win the fight against gravity that she'd been holding off through sheer will alone. "It's dropping," she grunted, sweat stinging her eyes despite the freezing cockpit air. "I can't hold it." 80 knots. The lift finally died completely. The right wing slammed down. The shattered landing gear strut hit the concrete first, held for a fraction of a second, and then disintegrated entirely, the massive titanium assembly, snapping like something brittle, the wheel tearing free and bouncing off into the blizzard, gone, with nothing left to support it. The entire right side of the aircraft crashed onto the tarmac. The noise was apocalyptic: radar-absorbent skin and carbon fiber, and titanium grinding against frozen concrete at 80 miles an hour, a deafening, high-pitched shriek that seemed to vibrate straight through her skull and into her teeth. A blinding rooster tail of orange sparks erupted from the right side of the fuselage, lighting the storm around her like fireworks nobody had asked for. The drag tried to spin her hard to the right. She stomped full left rudder, mashed the left brake to the floor. The jet fought her, the nose swerving toward the snowbanks lining the edge of the runway, every fiber of the airframe screaming its objection. Warning. Structural failure. Warning. Fire. The synthetic voice announced it with the same eerie calm it always used, as if superheated friction near a ruptured fuel line were a routine instead of the single thing capable of ending everything in the next 3 seconds. Keep her straight. Keep her straight. Holt was screaming over the radio, circling above, watching the sparks trailing behind her like something out of a war movie he wished he wasn't currently living through. Reese's arms burned, muscles cramping under strain that had gone on far longer than any human body was built to sustain. The smell of scorched metal and burning wire filled the cockpit. G-forces threw her violently side to side as the jet careened down the final 2,000 feet of runway. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrifying momentum began to bleed away. 50 knots, 30, 10. With one final, tearing groan of metal against concrete, the aircraft spun a violent 90 degrees and skidded to a dead halt, sideways across the runway, the right wingtip sheared clean off, the nose buried deep into a snowdrift. Then nothing. Only the sound of the wind howling across an empty, frozen island at the edge of the world. Falcon, Falcon, do you copy? Status, high above. Holt stared at his radar screen, heart hammering hard enough to hurt, watching the transponder signal for Bulldog 3 sit frozen on his display, indicating 0 airspeed and 0 altitude. She was down, but the radio had gone completely, horrifyingly silent. Warden 1, this is Bulldog 1. His voice cracked, all the swagger long since burned away. Bulldog 3 is down on the tarmac. No comms. Do we have a thermal signature? Did she burn? Aboard the AWACS, operators leaned into their infrared screens, faces bathed in pale green light, the heavy weather scattering their sensor data into chaotic static. Bulldog 1, we've got a heat plume on the runway, likely from the friction of the slide. The controller's voice stayed clipped, tense. Base emergency crews are rolling now, but visibility's near 0. Crosswinds are severe. We don't know if the fuel tank's ruptured. We don't know if she's alive. Holt banked hard, fighting the urge to dive beneath the cloud deck and see for himself, knowing there was nothing he could do from up here except wait and pray to whatever version of God still listened to fighter pilots. The man who had mocked her that morning would have traded his own jet right then, just to hear that infuriatingly calm robotic voice crackle across the radio one more time. Inside the crippled aircraft, the world had gone completely dark. The electrical systems had shorted entirely during the violent slide, every display dead, environmental controls offline, the roar of engines and shrieking alarms replaced by nothing but the rhythmic drumming of the blizzard against frosted glass. Reese Calder sat motionless, locked into her seat, chest heaving against the harness. For a long moment, she simply breathed. Let the sensory weight of survival settle over her, the freezing air, thick now, with the acrid stench of burnt carbon fiber and scorched wiring and lingering halon gas. Rule number 1 of a crash landing. Her old flight instructor's voice, unbidden, surfacing from somewhere deep and worn smooth by repetition. If the airframe stopped moving and you're not actively on fire, get out. Don't wait for the fuel lines to make up their mind. She reached up with trembling fingers, unlatched her oxygen mask, let it fall away, the raw freezing air biting instantly at her exposed skin. She reached for the canopy release. It didn't budge. The internal locking mechanism had frozen solid, the explosive detachment bolts rendered useless by total loss of battery power. Damn it, she hissed, the words sounding impossibly small inside the dark, frozen shell of the cockpit. She twisted around, fingers searching blindly along the bulkhead, behind her left shoulder for the manual canopy crank, a heavy steel handle built for exactly this kind of catastrophic failure, the kind nobody ever expected to actually need. She found it, flipped it out, began to crank. It was agonizing. Her arms felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, the muscles cramped and exhausted from wrestling 40,000 pounds of dying aircraft through a blizzard for the better part of 15 minutes. Every turn of the crank fought against a thick layer of ice, sealing the reinforced glass shut. Click, click, click. Outside, a convoy of fire rescue vehicles tore blindly down the runway, red and blue strobes barely piercing the driving wall of snow. The crews inside braced for the worst. They were expecting a body recovery. Instead, out of the whiteout, the terrifying silhouette of the F-22 emerged, leaning heavily onto its shattered right side. Skin scarred and scorched by friction, the right wingtip sheared away entirely, the nose buried in a snowdrift. But intact, no fireball, no wreckage field. As the lead vehicle screeched to a halt, crews scrambled out into the howling wind, dragging heavy hoses loaded with retardant foam, ready to douse whatever remained smoldering in the ruined engine bay. Before the fire chief could give the order, a sound cut through the gale, the canopy rising, slowly, mechanically, impossibly. A figure in a sage-green flight suit stood up inside the shattered cockpit, taking a deep, freezing breath of Aleutian air, like it was the first breath she'd ever drawn. She looked down at the rescue crew, every one of them frozen mid-motion, staring up at her in open disbelief. She didn't wave, didn't cheer. She simply unhooked her survival vest, gripped the rails of the cockpit, and slid down the side of the aircraft, landing boots first on the ice. She swayed for exactly 1 second, adrenaline finally beginning to crash out of her system in one long delayed wave. Then she locked her knees, stood tall, and let the storm howl around her, because she had survived worse than this, and some quiet, stubborn part of her had never once doubted that she would survive this too. 3 hours later, the worst of the storm finally broke enough to let Holt and Pratt land their own jets on the cleared section of runway. Inside Harrow Station's operations center, a squat, concrete relic humming under harsh fluorescent light, the kind of building that looked like it had been forgotten by everyone. Except the wind, the atmosphere was quiet, in a way that felt almost sacred. Holt walked in, still shedding his winter gear, eyes scanning the room, until they landed on the corner table, where Reese sat, a base medic hovering nearby, entirely ignored, while she nursed a steaming mug of black coffee with both hands. She looked almost exactly the way she had that morning. Calm, unassuming, entirely unbothered, except for the dark bruise blooming along her jaw, where the harness had bitten into her skin during the impact, and the faint, involuntary tremor, still working through her right hand every few seconds, a small aftershock her body hadn't yet agreed to let go of. Holt stopped a few feet from the table. Didn't say anything at first. Just looked at her, really looked, the way you look at someone after watching them do something you'll spend the rest of your life trying to describe accurately and failing every time. He reached up, unzipped the shoulder pocket of his flight suit, pulled free the dark, heavily embroidered patch of the 90th Fighter Squadron, the Diceman, the insignia he'd worn like a second skin for 15 years, and set it gently on the table beside her coffee mug. "I've flown combat for 15 years, he said, voice stripped of every ounce of the bravado that had filled the briefing room that morning. "Seen the best this Air Force has to offer. And that," he shook his head slightly, searching for a word that didn't feel small enough to be an insult, "that was the greatest piece of flying I have ever witnessed in my life." Reese looked down at the patch, traced the edge of it once with her thumb before lifting her eyes back to his. A faint, almost imperceptible ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth, the first real crack in the composure she'd worn all day. "Bit bumpy on the descent, Major." Holt let out a short, disbelieving laugh, dragging a chair out and dropping into it across from her. "Yeah." He shook his head, staring at the woman who had just conquered the Bering Sea on one wheel and no engine. "That's exactly what they say." He paused. "Welcome to the squadron, Falcon." She allowed herself, just for a moment, to feel something close to peace. It didn't last, because across the room, unnoticed by either of them, Colonel Ruth Callahan stood in the doorway, with a folder tucked under one arm, the maintenance log, printed now, metadata flagged and highlighted in red, and a look on her face that suggested the day's disasters were nowhere near finished unfolding. Reese caught the look before Callahan said a single word. Something in her chest went very still, the same cold, familiar stillness that had settled there hours earlier, staring at a batch number that shouldn't have matched anything at all. "Colonel," her voice came out steady. Careful, you have that look." Callahan crossed the room, set the folder down on the table without a word. Reese opened it, and felt 14 years of quiet, careful searching suddenly, violently, click into focus. The failure pattern, documented in the pages in front of her, the fracture point, the component batch, the precise mechanism of catastrophic breakdown matched, almost line for line, a report she had read more times than she could count. A report with her father's name at the top of it. A report that had closed his case with 2 words that had never once made sense to her. Pilot error. She stared at the page until the fluorescent light overhead started to blur at the edges, until Holt's voice asking if she was all right sounded like it was arriving from somewhere very far away. Because this wasn't coincidence anymore. This was a pattern, and patterns she'd learned a long time ago didn't happen by accident. Somewhere out there, someone had known. Someone had known exactly what this fracture point could do, exactly what it had already done once before, 14 years ago, to a pilot who had never made a careless mistake in his life. And they had let it happen again anyway. The folder sat open on the table between them, and the fluorescent light overhead did nothing to soften what was written across those pages. Reese didn't move, couldn't, not yet, because there was a version of this moment she'd imagined for 14 years quietly, privately, in the space between sleep and waking, in the long stretches of solo flight time where her mind wandered places she never let it go on the ground. In that version she found the proof. She confronted someone. There were words. There was justice, clean and immediate, the kind that closed a wound instead of just naming it. This didn't feel like that. This felt like standing at the edge of something enormous and realizing too late that the ground beneath her had already started to give way. "Reese," Holt's voice, careful now, the playful warmth from a moment ago completely gone. "You went someplace. Talk to me." She looked up, found Callahan's eyes instead of his. "This report." Her voice came out steady, which surprised her, given that nothing else in her body felt steady at all. "The failure signature, the fracture point, the batch." "I know," Callahan said quietly. "You knew before you brought it to me. I suspected." Callahan pulled out the chair across from her and sat, folding her hands together on the table with the deliberate stillness of someone who had delivered hard news before and understood that speed was not a kindness. "The maintenance log on your aircraft was altered 48 hours before your flight. Someone went into that file and rewrote it." Holt's head turned sharply. "Rewrote it? As in sabotage? As in someone didn't want a full inspection triggered on that turbine assembly?" Callahan's jaw tightened, which means someone already knew there was a problem with it. Reese's hand, resting flat against the table, curled slowly into a fist, because there it was, the word she'd spent 14 years circling without ever quite landing on it. Someone knew. Not an accident, not bad luck, not a random fracture in a random blade on a random morning, a known defect, buried, ignored, allowed to keep flying on aircraft that carried real people who trusted every green light on every panel to mean exactly what it claimed to mean. "There's a batch number," Reese said, slowly, "on this report. Same batch number I found taped behind an intake panel this morning. Same batch number." She stopped, because saying the next part out loud made it real in a way it hadn't quite been yet, even sitting there in black and white in front of her. "Same batch number. As what?" Holt pressed, gently. Nothing left of the man who'd mocked her that morning. Just quiet, careful attention now. Reese pulled her flight bag off the back of the chair, unzipped the inside compartment she never opened in front of anyone, drew out a folder so worn at the creases it had gone soft as fabric. She set it on the table beside Callahan's. "My father," she said, "Colonel Thomas Calder, 14 years ago. Training flight. Aircraft came apart in the air and the inquiry closed the case in 4 pages. Her voice thinned, just slightly on the next words. "Pilot error." Holt went very still. He didn't say anything for a long moment. because everyone in that room had heard the name Calder before. Somewhere in the particular way old aviation stories drifted through squadron rooms, long after the people who lived them had moved on or been buried. A legendary pilot. A mystery that never quite got resolved. Not really. Not to anyone's actual satisfaction. Your father, Holt said slowly, was Thomas Calder. Was Reese. Callahan's voice, careful. This report, she tapped the folder in front of Reese, was generated after your incident today. But the failure pattern in it matches something in the historical database. I pulled it while you were still in the air. She hesitated. It matches your father's incident. Almost exactly. Reese closed her eyes. Almost exactly. 2 words doing the work of 14 years. Because she'd spent her whole adult life collecting fragments, a report here, a maintenance record there, half conversations with retired mechanics who remembered things they weren't supposed to talk about, trying to build something solid enough to stand on. And every single time, it had slipped through her fingers before she could turn it into proof. Now it hadn't slipped. Now it was sitting on a folding table in a Cold War relic of a building at the edge of the world, next to a coffee mug and a squadron patch, undeniable. Who signed off on the batch, she said. Not a question. A demand, quiet and absolute. Callahan flipped to the second page, traced a line down with one finger, stopped. Something crossed her face, not surprise exactly. Something closer to dread. What? Reese said. The original component sign-off. Callahan's voice had gone very flat. 14 years ago. Quality assurance review, base level. Approved by then Major Edwin Voss. The name landed in the room like something physical. Reese's stomach dropped. Because Edwin Voss wasn't a stranger, wasn't some name buried in an old file she'd have to go digging for. Edwin Voss was the base commander of Wolfhaven. The man who had personally signed her transfer orders 3 weeks ago. The man who had shaken her hand a beat too long, told her he'd known her father, called it a terrible shame, and smiled the whole time he said it. The man whose office sat 2 doors down from the briefing room where she'd been laughed at that same morning. The man in charge of this entire base. He's here, she said, barely a whisper. He's been here the whole time. He shook my hand 3 weeks ago and told me he was sorry about my father. Pratt, who had been quiet in the corner through most of this, finally spoke. You think he knew? That day? Standing there shaking your hand? I don't know, Reese said, and that somehow was worse than knowing. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Outside, the wind kept battering the concrete walls of the operations center, indifferent to everything unfolding inside it. Somewhere down the hall, a coffee machine gurgled through its last cycle of the night, oblivious. Holt was the one who finally broke the silence. So what do we do? Simple question, impossible answer. Because Reese Calder had spent 14 years imagining this exact fork in the road and had never, not once, arrived at a version of it that felt clean. We don't do anything yet, Callahan said carefully. Not until we understand the full picture. Voss approved a component sign-off 14 years ago. That doesn't automatically mean he knew it was defective. It could have passed every standard at the time. Testing protocols change. Except the batch got reused. Reese's voice sharpened, the exhaustion in it burning off under something hotter. 8 months ago. On my aircraft. On a base he commands. And 48 hours before my flight, someone edited the maintenance log to make sure a full inspection never got triggered. I know, Callahan said. I'm not defending him. I'm telling you we need this airtight before you walk into his office and say any of it out loud. Because the moment you do, if we're wrong about even one detail, he has every tool available to bury this so deep it never sees daylight again. Reese pressed her palms flat against the table, forcing her breathing to slow. She's right. You know she's right. You've waited 14 years. You can wait one more day to do this correctly. Except every instinct in her body was screaming the opposite. Screaming that men like Voss didn't stay vulnerable for long. That evidence had a way of vanishing the moment the person it threatened realized it existed. That she'd already lost 14 years to patience and quiet and careful, methodical waiting, and every one of those years had cost her something she couldn't get back. We move fast, she said, but we move smart. Callahan nodded slowly, agreed. Holt leaned forward, elbows on the table, jaw set in a way that made him look 10 years older than he had in the briefing room that morning. Then tell me what you need, because whatever this is, he gestured at the 2 folders sitting side by side. I'm in, all the way in. Reese looked at him for a long moment. The same man who'd called her a rookie 8 hours ago, who'd told her the sky would swallow her whole, who'd mocked a call sign he now understood better than most people ever would. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why does this matter to you?" Holt didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had lost every trace of its usual bravado. "Because I watched you land a jet with no engine and no gear through a storm that should have killed you twice over," he said. "And somewhere in the last 12 hours, I figured out that everything I thought I knew about you was wrong. Which means, maybe I need to start paying better attention to what's actually true instead of what's easy to assume." Reese felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, the first real give in a knot she'd been carrying for longer than she could properly measure. "All right," she said. "Then here's where we start." They spent the next 6 hours in a windowless side office at Harrow Station. The three of them, hunched over a single working terminal, coffee going cold beside stacks of printed records. Nobody had bothered to organize into anything resembling order. Callahan pulled every maintenance file connected to the turbine batch, cross-referencing serial numbers against every aircraft that had ever carried a component from that same production run. The pattern that emerged was worse than any of them had expected. 6 aircraft, over 14 years. 4 of them had experienced some version of engine trouble that had been logged, investigated, and quietly closed without ever tracing the root cause back to the shared point of failure. One of them had been Thomas Calder's. One of them had been Reese's. 4 incidents. Callahan's voice was hollow by the time she finished reading the last file aloud. 4 separate investigations, different bases, different review boards. Nobody cross-referenced the component history because nobody was looking for a pattern. They were looking for someone to blame. "Pilot error," Reese said quietly. Every time, Callahan confirmed. Holt sat back, dragging both hands down his face. 4 pilots, blamed for something that wasn't their fault. Because somebody decided replacing a bad batch of turbine components across an entire fleet cost more than letting 4 investigations quietly close the book on 4 separate people. "Not 4 people," Reese said. 3, that we know survived to fly again after their incidents. And my father." The room went quiet, because that math had a weight to it that none of them wanted to sit with directly. A man was dead. 3 others had likely spent years carrying blame that was never theirs to carry. Their careers shaped, maybe ended by a lie, stamped onto an official record with someone's signature at the bottom. "I want their names," Reese said. "The other 3, wherever they are now. Whatever happened to them?" Callahan hesitated. "That's outside the scope of tonight." "It's not outside the scope of anything," Reese said. "It's the whole point. This isn't just about my father anymore. It's about every single person that batch touched." Callahan looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and pulled the names. Captain Denise Okafor, grounded 11 years ago after an engine fire during a training exercise, blamed for improper throttle management, quietly reassigned to a desk job in logistics before leaving the service altogether 2 years later. Major Trent Whitfield, survived a compressor failure 9 years ago, cleared to fly again after 18 months of review, but passed over for promotion 3 times afterward, the incident quietly following him through every board that ever considered his file. Captain Louis Anders, the most recent 6 years ago, ejected safely from a burning aircraft over open water, spent 4 days recovering from hypothermia, and was medically retired 8 months later after what his file described, in flat clinical language, as persistent anxiety related to flight operations. Reese read each name twice, then a 3rd time, because these weren't abstractions anymore. These were people with families, careers, entire lives quietly reshaped by a decision made in a budget meeting 14 years ago by a man who had, 3 weeks prior, shaken her hand and called her father's death a shame. "We need Voss's original sign-off documentation," Reese said finally. "Not the summary, the full technical review. If he saw test data showing a fracture risk in that batch and approved it anyway, that's not negligence. That's a decision, a choice made on purpose, and covered up on purpose every time it almost came apart at the seams." Callahan hesitated. That documentation would be sealed under his authority as base commander. "I don't have clearance to pull it without triggering a flag straight back to his office." "Then we need someone who does." All three of them looked at each other in the same instant, arriving at the same name without needing to say it out loud. General Harlan Foster answered the secure line on the second ring, his face appearing on the screen, looking every bit as exhausted as everyone crowded into that small side office at Harrow Station. Colonel Callahan. His eyes moved past her, landing on Reese. Captain Calder. Glad to see that legend wasn't exaggerated. General. Reese's voice was steady, but there was an edge underneath it now that hadn't been there hours earlier. I need your help with something that's bigger than today's incident. Foster's expression shifted, the polite relief of the moment giving way to something more guarded. Go on. Callahan laid it out for him, clean, methodical, exactly the way a career officer presented information she needed someone else to take seriously. The batch number, the 4 incidents spread across 14 years. The 3 other pilots whose careers had quietly ended in the wreckage of a decision none of them ever knew had been made about their lives. The altered maintenance log, edited 48 hours before Reese's flight. The original sign-off, 14 years old, bearing the signature of a man who now commanded the very base where the pattern had just repeated itself. Foster listened without interrupting once. When Callahan finished, he sat back, jaw tight, and was quiet long enough that Reese started to wonder if the connection had frozen. Say the name again, he said finally. Edwin Voss, Callahan said. Base Commander, Wolfhaven. Foster closed his eyes briefly. I served with Voss, he said, voice low. 20 years ago, before either of you were flying combat aircraft. His eyes opened, found Reese's through the screen. Your father and Voss came up together. Same squadron, different assignments. I always understood them to be close. Something cold moved through Reese's chest. Close, she repeated. Close enough, Foster said, carefully, that I find it very hard to believe Edwin Voss would knowingly sign off on something that killed his own friend, and then say nothing about it for 14 years. With respect, General. Reese's voice hardened. I don't need you to find it believable. I need you to pull the sealed documentation and let the evidence speak for itself. A long silence stretched across the line. I can authorize that, Foster said finally. But Captain, once I pull it, there's no putting it back. If this is what you believe it is, it ends careers. Maybe more than his. It already ended my father's life, Reese said. 14 years ago. I think that's the number that should matter here. Foster held her gaze through the screen for a long moment. Then he nodded, once sharp and final. Give me 4 hours. The 4 hours felt longer than the 15 minutes she'd spent gliding a dying aircraft through a blizzard earlier that same day. Reese didn't sleep, couldn't. She sat in the corner of the operations center, wrapped in a blanket someone had pushed into her hands at some point without her fully registering it, staring at nothing, replaying 14 years of fragments in a loop that refused to slow down. He came up with my father. They were close enough that Foster doesn't believe he'd do this. Except the evidence doesn't care what anyone believes. Evidence just sits there, being true, whether or not it's convenient. She thought about her mother, back home in a small house outside Colorado Springs, who had spent 14 years quietly grieving a man the Air Force had blamed for his own death, who had stopped talking about him, eventually not because she'd healed, but because grief with nowhere to go had a way of going quiet instead. She thought about the 4-page report, folded soft at the creases, riding in her flight bag through every posting, every test flight, every quietly obsessive hour she'd spent trying to prove what her gut had always known. He didn't make a mistake. Somebody let this happen to him, and then let it happen again, and again, and again, and then let it happen to me. She thought about Denise Okafor, reassigned to a desk somewhere, and eventually gone from the service entirely. About Trent Whitfield, passed over 3 times for a promotion he'd probably earned, never once told why. About Louis Anders, medically retired for anxiety the Air Force had itself manufactured, and then blamed him for having. None of them knew. That was the part that kept catching in her throat every time she circled back to it. None of them had any idea that the thing that ended their careers, reshaped their families, followed them quietly into every job interview and every sleepless night since, hadn't been a personal failure at all. It had been a signature on a budget line. 14 years ago, Holt sat down across from her at some point, saying nothing, just present, the way people are present for each other when there's genuinely nothing useful left to say. Pratt brought coffee, neither of them drank. Callahan worked the terminal in the corner, jaw tight, refreshing a secure inbox every few minutes, like it might somehow arrive faster if she watched closely enough. At the 3-hour 40-minute mark, it did. The file that came through was thick, technical, dense, with engineering language that took Callahan nearly 20 minutes just to walk them through in plain terms. But the conclusion, once they reached it, was devastatingly simple. 14 years ago, an internal engineering review had flagged the turbine batch for a stress fracture risk under sustained high-cycle conditions. The recommendation had been clear: ground the batch. Replace every affected component across the fleet before continuing operations. The estimated cost of that recall, at the time, had run into the tens of millions. Major Edwin Voss, in his role reviewing the quality assurance file, had overridden the recommendation. His justification, typed in flat bureaucratic language that did nothing to soften what it actually meant, cited operational readiness requirements and budget constraints for the fiscal year. The fracture risk, he'd written, was statistically low enough to accept. 3 weeks later, Thomas Calder's aircraft had come apart in the air. The subsequent inquiry, reviewed, in part, by the same office Voss oversaw, had closed the case as pilot error within 90 days. Reese read the final page twice, then a third time, because some part of her brain kept refusing to fully process it, kept expecting a different word to appear if she just looked hard enough. It never did. He knew, she said quietly. Before my father ever got in that aircraft, he knew. Nobody in the room said anything, because there was nothing left to say that could soften what those 2 sentences meant. She set the pages down with hands that had gone completely steady, the trembling exhaustion of the last 20 hours suddenly burned away by something far colder and far more useful. I want to see him, she said. Now. Colonel Edwin Voss's office at Wolfhaven sat at the far end of the administration building, behind a door with his name stenciled in gold lettering that had probably looked impressive the day it was installed, and now just looked like something waiting to be taken down. He was already awake when they arrived. Of course he was, given that half the base had spent the last 20 hours dealing with the fallout of an aircraft that had nearly killed one of his pilots. He stood when Reese walked in, flanked by Foster, on the secure video link projected onto a wall screen, Callahan carrying the folder, Holt standing quietly by the door, like a man determined not to miss a single word of whatever was about to happen. Captain Calder. Voss's voice carried the same warm, paternal authority she'd heard from him 3 weeks earlier, signing her transfer paperwork with an easy smile she'd taken, at the time, for simple professional courtesy. I heard about yesterday. Extraordinary work. I intend to personally recommend you for— Stop! The word came out flat. Final. Voss blinked, thrown by the interruption in a way that suggested very few people in this building had ever dared cut him off mid-sentence. Captain? I know about the batch, Reese said. I know about the review 14 years ago. I know you overrode the recall recommendation to protect a budget line. I know my father's aircraft came apart because of a defect you'd already been warned about. And I know you signed the paperwork that called his death pilot error instead of telling the truth. The color drained slowly out of Voss's face. Not all at once, in stages, like watching a man realize, sentence by sentence, exactly how much ground had already been lost before he'd even understood there was a fight happening. That report, he said carefully, is 14 years old. Sealed. You have no authority to— I authorized it. Foster's voice cut in from the wall screen, hard and unmistakable. 2 hours ago, Edwin. It's over. Voss's jaw worked silently for a moment. Then, quietly, something in him seemed to collapse inward. He sat back down heavily in his chair, the practiced authority draining out of his posture entirely, leaving behind something smaller, older, a man finally facing a debt he'd spent 14 years pretending didn't exist. Thomas was my friend, he said, voice barely above a whisper. You have to understand that. We came up together. I was at his wedding. I held you at your christening, Reese, though I doubt you remember that. I don't, Reese said, but I remember every version of the 4-page report that told me my father made a mistake he never made in his life. I read it so many times I could recite it in my sleep. I built my entire career trying to prove it wrong. And it turns out I didn't need to prove anything. You already knew. The recall would have grounded half the fleet. Voss's voice cracked. The words coming faster now. A man finally letting something loose that he'd clearly kept buried under 14 years of careful silence. We were 3 weeks from a readiness inspection. If I'd grounded that many aircraft, it would have ended careers, mine included. I told myself the risk was low. I told myself, "You told yourself a lie," Reese said, "and then you watched it kill him. And instead of telling the truth, you let the Air Force blame a dead man who couldn't defend himself, because that was easier than admitting what your decision actually cost." Voss said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that could undo any of it. There were 3 others, Reese continued, quieter now, her voice trembling for the first time since she'd walked through that door. Denise Okafor, Trent Whitfield, Louis Anders. Do those names mean anything to you? Something flickered across Voss's face. Recognition, guilt maybe, or something close enough to it that Reese couldn't tell the difference anymore. "I know the names," he admitted. "They don't know why their careers ended," Reese said. "They still don't know. They've spent years thinking it was something they did wrong, something about them. And it was never them. It was a decision you made about a budget line before any of them ever climbed into a cockpit." Voss lowered his head. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the low electrical hum of the overhead lights and the distant howl of wind pressing against the windows. "And when the batch got reused 8 months ago," Reese pressed, "on my aircraft, on your base, did you know that too? Or did you just never bother to check?" "I didn't know it had been reused," he said finally. "I swear to you, I didn't know. Not until yesterday. But you knew someone edited my maintenance log 48 hours before I flew," Reese pressed. "Because that's not something that happens on its own." Voss's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the door, toward the hallway outside, where, somewhere in this building, someone else who had known about the batch, who had understood exactly what a full inspection would uncover, had made a quiet, desperate decision to bury the evidence rather than risk it surfacing again. "Who?" Reese said. "Flat absolute. The name that eventually surfaced belonged to a logistics officer 3 levels down from Voss, a man named Captain Roy Denning, who had personally overseen component procurement for the base and who had recognized the batch number the moment Reese's aircraft was scheduled for turbine service 8 months earlier. Denning had made the same calculation Voss had made 14 years before him, weighing the cost of a recall against the convenience of silence, and had chosen silence, believing the odds were simply too low for it to matter. He was placed under investigation within the hour, the maintenance records altered metadata, providing evidence too precise to argue against. When confronted, he offered no real defense, only a hollow explanation that the fleet had flown thousands of hours on that batch without further incident, and he genuinely believed, in his own words, that the danger had passed. Reese thought about that phrase for a long time afterward. The danger had passed. As if danger were something with a shelf life. As if a fracture growing quietly inside a piece of titanium somehow expired on a schedule convenient to the people responsible for catching it. Voss was relieved of command. By the end of the day, General Foster personally overseeing the transition with a grim, weary efficiency that suggested he'd hoped never to have to do something like this to a man he'd once called a friend. The full findings were forwarded to Air Combat Command, and from there, up a chain that eventually reached far enough to guarantee the story would not quietly disappear the way similar stories sometimes did. Reese sat through most of it in a strange, suspended state, present for every meeting, every statement, every formal interview, but somehow distant from all of it too, like she was watching the resolution of someone else's 14-year search rather than her own. Because the ending, when it finally arrived, didn't feel the way she'd imagined it would. There was no single triumphant moment, no dramatic reversal broadcast to a courtroom full of witnesses, just paperwork, signatures, a slow procedural unwinding of a lie that had been allowed to stand for far too long, handled with the same bureaucratic flatness that had originally buried it in the first place. It should have felt hollow. It didn't, because somewhere in the middle of all that paperwork, a single new document was generated, one that mattered more to her than every other page combined. An amended finding on the death of Colonel Thomas Calder. Cause: mechanical failure resulting from a known and unaddressed component defect. Finding of pilot error hereby vacated and reversed. She read it standing in a hallway at Wolfhaven, 3 days after the crash, her hands shaking for the first time since the moment she'd fought a dying jet through a blizzard and won. 14 years. 2 sentences. And her father, finally, officially, entirely innocent of the thing that had followed his name into the ground. She called her mother that same evening. The line crackled for a moment before her mother's voice came through, warm and familiar, and entirely unaware of what the next few minutes were about to change. "Reese? Honey? It's late there, isn't it? Is everything all right?" Reese sat on the edge of her bed, the amended report resting in her lap, and realized she didn't actually know how to start. 14 years of searching, and she'd never once rehearsed the moment she'd finally get to say it out loud. "Mom," she said, "I found it. What actually happened to Dad?" Silence on the line, a long one. "Reese." Her mother's voice had gone very quiet. "What do you mean, found it?" "It wasn't him," Reese said, and felt her own voice finally start to break, the composure that had carried her through 14 years. And one blizzard and one impossible landing finally gave way all at once, right there, alone in a small room at the edge of the world. It was never him. There was a defect. Somebody knew about it and let him fly anyway. They just needed somebody to blame, and it was easier to blame a man who couldn't argue back. Her mother didn't say anything for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick, unsteady, carrying 14 years of grief that had never once had anywhere honest to land. "I always knew," she whispered. "I told them. I told the review board he'd never make a mistake like that. Nobody listened." "I know," Reese said. "I'm sorry it took so long." "You found it," her mother said, and something in her voice shifted not away from grief, but through it, into something that sounded, for the first time in 14 years, like relief. "Reese, you actually found it." "I had help," Reese said, "but yes, I found it." They talked for a long time after that. Not about the report anymore. About her father, the real version of him. Not the 4 flattened paragraphs that had tried to replace him. The way he used to hum off key while making breakfast. The way he'd once driven 3 hours in a snowstorm just to watch her play in a middle school band concert. Nobody else's parents had bothered to attend. The way he used to describe the sky as a conversation, not a job. By the time they hung up, it was well past midnight, and Reese sat alone in the quiet of her room feeling something she hadn't expected to feel at the end of all this. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. Something that felt, for the first time in 14 years, almost like rest. The squadron gathered 2 days later for a ceremony nobody had explicitly called a celebration, but that felt exactly like one anyway. Commander Bragg stood at the front of the briefing room, the same room where Reese had been laughed at for claiming a call sign nobody believed she'd earned, and read a formal commendation into the record. His voice, carrying none of its usual clipped efficiency, weighted instead with something that sounded almost like pride. Reese stood at attention through most of it, aware of every eye in the room fixed on her, aware that this was the same room, the same pilots, the same walls that had witnessed her humiliation less than a week earlier. Nobody was laughing now. When Bragg finished, Holt stepped forward out of turn, technically, breaking protocol in a way that made Bragg's eyebrow lift half an inch before he chose, wisely, to let it happen. "Squadron," Holt said, addressing the room instead of Reese directly. "Most of you weren't there for the landing. I was. And I'm telling you right now, nothing I say is going to do it justice. So I'm not going to try." He turned to Reese. "Instead, I want to say something simpler." He reached into his jacket and drew out a small, embroidered patch, not the squadron insignia this time, but something new, something Reese didn't immediately recognize, until she saw the shape of it clearly. A falcon. Wings fully extended, stitched in dark thread against a sage green backing that matched her flight suit exactly. "The squadron voted," Holt said, "unanimously. We want this on your uniform. Permanently. Not because command assigned it to you, because you earned it. In front of every single one of us. And we don't ever want anyone walking into this room again and laughing at that name without knowing exactly what it means." Reese took the patch from his outstretched hand, held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the stitching against her palm. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then, glancing around the room, at faces that had gone from mocking to respectful in the space of a single impossible flight. She added, "All of you." Pratt, standing near the back, raised his coffee mug in something that looked suspiciously like a toast. To Falcon, the room echoed it back. To Falcon. Near the doorway, quiet and slightly apart from the rest, Airman Wesley Tate stood watching with an expression. Reese caught and understood immediately the particular mixture of relief and lingering guilt that came from knowing you'd noticed something and let it slide. After the room began to empty, she walked over to him. "You had that look during the ceremony," she said. "The one that means you're carrying something." Tate hesitated, then, haltingly, told her about the discoloration on the turbine blade 2 weeks earlier, about deciding it wasn't worth flagging, about the quiet, sick feeling that had sat in his stomach every hour since her engine had exploded. "I should have said something," he finished. Reese considered him for a long moment. "You were 22 years old, working under a supervisor who waved you along," she said finally. "The people who should have caught this had 14 years and a full engineering review telling them exactly what to look for, and they buried it anyway. That's not the same thing as missing a smudge on a blade during a routine check." "Doesn't feel that different," Tate admitted. "It is, though," Reese said. "The difference is you're standing here telling me the truth voluntarily, and it took me 14 years and a plane crash to drag the truth out of the people who actually had a duty to tell it." She paused. "Write it down. Everything you noticed, everything you remember. Submit it through Callahan. Not because you're in trouble, because the review board needs every data point they can get. If we're going to make sure this batch gets pulled from the entire fleet, not just the aircraft that already failed." Tate nodded slowly, something in his shoulders loosening for the first time in what looked like weeks. "Yes, ma'am." "And Tate," he looked up. "Next time you notice something," Reese said, "say something. Even if you're not sure. Even if it feels foolish. I'd rather stand in a hangar listening to 20 false alarms than sit in a briefing room hearing about one more pilot who didn't come home because everybody assumed somebody else would catch it." "Yes, ma'am," he said again, and this time it sounded like he meant it all the way through. That evening, alone in the small officer's quarters she'd been assigned 3 weeks earlier, Reese sat on the edge of her bed and opened the worn, soft-creased folder one final time. The old report. The one that had ridden with her through every posting, every deployment, every quiet, obsessive hour of searching. Pilot error. She read the words one last time, not because she needed to anymore, but because some part of her wanted to mark the moment properly, the way you mark the end of something that had shaped nearly half your life. Then she set the old report aside and placed the new one on top of it, finding vacated and reversed. 2 documents. 14 years apart, finally telling the same true story instead of 2 conflicting ones. She thought about her mother, whose voice on the phone had carried something lighter than Reese had heard in it in over a decade. She thought about the 3 other pilots buried somewhere in that 14-year pattern of failures. Okafor, Whitfield, Anders, names she now carried the way she'd once carried only her father's. Foster had already begun the process of reopening each of their cases. It wouldn't undo what they'd lost, but it would, finally, tell them the truth, the same way it had finally been told to her. And she thought about the room full of pilots who had laughed at her call sign a week ago and now wore a version of it, stitched onto her uniform out of genuine hard-won respect. She looked out the small window of her quarters, out toward the flight line, where the Raptors sat lined up under floodlights, patient and still, waiting for the next mission the way they always did. Tomorrow, she'd fly again, not because the Air Force required it, because flying had never really been about proving anything to the men in that briefing room, or even to herself. It had always quietly been about him, about the conversation between a person and the sky that her father had taught her to love before she'd fully understood what it might one day cost her to keep having it. She closed the folder, set it carefully on the small table beside her bed, no longer something she needed to guard so tightly, no longer a wound she had to carry alone. 6 weeks later, on a clear, cold morning with the mountains sharp and blue against the horizon, Reese drove out to the small military cemetery on the edge of Wolf Haven's grounds, the amended report folded neatly in her jacket pocket. Her father's grave sat near the tree line, simple and modest, the kind of marker that had never fully captured the size of the man buried beneath it. She knelt in the frost beside it, set the amended report down against the stone, waited at one corner with a small rock so the wind wouldn't carry it away. For a long moment she didn't say anything at all, because there weren't words sized correctly for 14 years. 14 years of carrying something this heavy. And she'd never been a person who spoke just to fill silence for its own sake. "I got it," she finally said, quiet, the words fogging faintly in the cold air. "Took longer than I wanted. Took almost costing me everything to finally land in the right place at the right time. But I got it." The wind moved gently through the trees behind her, the only answer the morning had to offer. "I used to think I had to become exactly like you to prove it wasn't your fault," she said. "Turns out I just had to keep paying attention. Keep asking the question everyone else stopped asking a long time ago." She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone. "You didn't make a mistake," she whispered. "I always knew that. Now everyone else does too." She stayed there a long while, letting the cold settle into her bones, letting 14 years of carefully managed grief finally quietly begin to soften into something closer to peace. Behind her, faint against the wind, she heard the low rumble of engines starting somewhere on the flight line, the sound she'd loved since childhood, since the first time her father had held her hand at an air show and let her feel a formation fly by in her chest instead of just her ears. She smiled, just slightly, and stood. "I have to go," she said softly. "Squadron's waiting." She touched the top of the headstone once, the way she always had, ever since she was a girl too young to understand what any of it would eventually cost her to carry. Then she turned, walked back toward the flight line, toward the aircraft waiting patient and gleaming under a sky finally, mercifully clear, and let herself, for the first time in 14 years, simply be exactly who she already was. Not a mystery to solve, not a wound to carry, just Reese Calder, Captain Daughter Falcon,